All right, let's go to the phone calls. And let's start off with Alessandro, who's calling us out of New Jersey. Thank you very much for holding. What was your reaction when you heard the news yesterday that there would be no indictment in the Eric Garner case?
Well, there are so many cases where the police, when they interact with citizens, their biggest mistake is that they are forgetting that citizens have the right to the presumption of innocence. And the issue is that the police just act on the presumption that people are guilty. And and when Mr. Lynch says that we should train citizens not to resist arrest, I think he's putting the cart before the horse. It's the police who have to presume that the person they're accosting is innocent and act accordingly.
Mayo, I'm curious, is that true? I mean, in the courts, everybody has the presumption of innocence, but if the police are working to make an arrest, they have reasonable cause to believe that somebody's committed a crime.
There's certain things the police can do based upon a reasonable suspicion that a crime occurred, and then beyond that, if they have probable cause to believe you committed a crime, then they can make an arrest. So in the case of Mr. Garner, if the police had probable cause to believe even something as small as selling these cigarettes...
And they did. He'd been arrested more than 30 times for similar offenses.
And they may have even observed it. Then they have the ability to arrest. I mean, you can even be arrested on a vehicle and traffic case. You get a traffic ticket, but you use your better judgment. You use your reasonable
judgment. It's a discretion call.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, it's loose cigarettes. Right. And I'm not saying that you just let anyone do whatever they want, but with 6 or so officers around at the time, was the actions that they took warranted? And as the consequence that we all know happened, was that justice that day? Let's see what Andy has to say. Andy's calling us from Yorktown. Andy, I understand you're a supervising officer. Is that correct?
My question is to the panel that the female supervisor, sergeant, who was on the scene, who was there for the entire incident, did she bear any responsibility? Did she fail to act like a supervisor? Did she take any action other than stand there with her hands folded?
In fact, and to Andy's point, in fact, as we understand here, there was originally an officer on the scene, called for backup, and they called for a supervisor. They came on scene. It was it was an officer, a female officer of color, I believe, who was there on the scene. What kind of culpability, Mayo, would she have out of this?
I think she may have significant culpability, and that's a great point, because what happened in this grand jury presentation is that you focused on one person. And this didn't happen in a vacuum. You gave everybody else that was there immunity, essentially. And the supervisor takes control of the area. That's why you call for a supervisor. That person is supposed to have the judgment that it takes to keep things reasonable and calm and to get the best possible result to prevent the use of force from having to be implemented. And if she didn't take control and realize that at a bare minimum that once Mr. Garner's on the ground that you don't need to pile onto his head's not going to throw officers off. It may have saved his life right there.
And I want to go through the legal aspect that you can help us out with. First, take a listen to what the U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder had to say.
Now that the local investigation has concluded, I'm here to announce that the Justice Department will proceed with a federal civil rights investigation into Mr. Garner's death. The department will conduct a complete review of the material gathered during the local investigation.
All right, so the feds are getting involved, and the grand jury chose not to try Daniel Pantaleo. Has sparked this. The AG saying, and he made it very clear last night, he will make a federal case out of it as the Justice Department will now launch that formal investigation. And those federal investigations can have some real impacts. And we found that out today, Andrew, in of all places, Cleveland.
Yeah, Rich, the Justice Department is now going to appoint a monitor and could take other steps against the Cleveland police after finding systemic patterns of abuse and misuse of force. And the list is staggering of the abuses by the Cleveland police. They used unjustifiable force against criminal suspects and innocent victims of crime. Officers punched a 13-year-old handcuffed boy suspected of shoplifting. They shot at unarmed kidnapping victim who was only wearing underwear. Officers fired at people who the feds say posed no imminent threat. They used their guns carelessly hitting people in the head, and they fired in areas despite little threats, or despite there being threats to innocent bystanders who were nearby. Now, that report did not include the recent shooting of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was shot and killed by a Cleveland officer, as you'll see in this video, as Rice held a pellet gun just 2 seconds after the officer approached Rice in a park. The officer, Timothy Lohman, had previously been pushed out of a small-town police department after he was deemed emotionally unstable and unfit for duty, especially in his handling of firearms. That's a fact the Cleveland PD apparently failed to check when they were hiring him. And while the federal investigation here right now is only focused on the Garner case, this case could easily be seen as just a drop in a bucket. Take chokehold cases, for example. The new NYPD Civilian Complaint Review Board found that since 2008, 1,100 chokehold complaints were reported, and of them the department substantiated 10 of them, just 10. And the worst discipline that any officer received, losing 10 days of vacation time. And then there's this list of deadly police encounters in the city, high-profile cases, most of which ended without indictment or conviction. Those names since the 1990s include Anthony Baez, Amadou Diallo, Patrick Dorismond, Timothy Stansberry, Sean Bell, Eric Garner, and Akai Gurley. Gurley's death, of course, is the one in Brooklyn, and that could be the next big stain for the city's justice system. On November 20th, he was shot and killed by a police officer in the stairwell of a Brooklyn housing project. Police are now calling that shooting an accident, Rich.
There was a debate at the table last night, Mayor, when we were with our legal panel, as to what the Justice Department can and can't do in terms of the threshold. What do you think? I mean, I hear the words, but for them to come over, in effect, the grand jury, do they have a threshold? Can they prove that there was, in effect, racial bias that was implied here?
They don't necessarily even have to do that. They just have to show that there's official misconduct and that there was an intentional act on the part of the police officers and that they used their position to harm him, to harm Mr. Garner. The other thing is that we don't know how the case was submitted into the grand jury. We're learning right now, we learned yesterday that in the Michael Brown case, that the prosecution actually gave the grand jury the wrong law. They gave them unconstitutional law to consider. I mean, clearly, you would hope that the federal government's not going to go forward and do that.
But there has been questions from what we have learned about the process as related to Garner, which was a lot of people were given immunity in this, which is unusual, right? In law enforcement.
That immunity may not go forward and benefit them in a federal prosecution. That's most likely use immunity for the state case. Now, there can still be new evidence that is determined based upon additional investigation. There may be witnesses who are compelled to testify because it may be in their best interest to testify. And some of the people who were given immunity may be targets of the federal investigation anyway, which may go toward that, the supervisor, the sergeant who really didn't take command of the scene, as well as possibly even the EMTs.
Mayo, would the feds have to prove that Pantaleo violated Garner's civil rights, or that this process with the grand jury violated Garner's civil rights?
No, they'd have to show that the individuals violated his civil rights.
So it's retrying the case, essentially, in terms of civil rights.
And it would be the same thing as what occurred in the Rodney King case.
Right.
And again here, we mentioned the Gurley case, Kai Gurley case. The guy was just leaving his apartment. Forget about armed or whatever else. A rookie cop had his gun drawn as he was going up that stairwell that was dimly lit, and he shot and killed him in the chest, Mr. Gurley. No one alleges, for example, weapon or any threat whatsoever. And then the PBA even said that maybe if they fixed the light, we wouldn't have had the problem. So we still have a huge disconnect about where negligence begins and ends in these things. All right, we're going to jump to a break here. When we come back, we're going to go right to the phone lines, and also we'll head back out to Foley Square. We'll check back in with Dominic. Stay with us.